When you work at a job like ours, it's good to have hobbies. Actually, it's pretty vital to have hobbies. You need to be able to do something to take your mind off the shitty parts of the job. Whether that's instructing an elderly woman to break her dying husband's ribs, or being threatened with rape and murder because an ambulance hasn't arrived yet. We all have ways of de-stressing, and different things work at different times. One of our seasoned call handlers knits. It's not unusual to see her on a cardiac arrest call, counting compressions aloud while knitting woolen squares. Totally calm and collected. Some people lift weights, some people write, some people have sex. I'd like to say it isn't like a TV drama where everyone is screwing each other, but it's exactly like a TV sitcom. I stay out of all that. I have a hobby of my own. I learn languages. In comparison to weightlifting and screwing colleagues, I know that makes me sound like a complete loser. But it helps. I can immerse myself in something different for short bursts. I use apps, phrasebooks, videos, anything to get myself to a decent conversational level in certain languages, or even further if I enjoy it. Since starting my job in ambulance control, I've become as good as fluent in 2 new languages, and can hold a decent conversation in 3 more. I'm not talking about my linguistic adventures solely for the purpose of illustrating what a loser I am. There's a point to it all, I promise. It leads into my next story. Not as sad as the last one, or as creepy as the test calls, but it was one of those moments that made me question my sanity, as well as my colors. The call didn't come through to me initially. It went to Naomi, one of my colleagues. I could hear her getting more and more frustrated with the caller, and speaking slower and slower. The classic sign of a call handler trying to communicate with someone hard of hearing. I shrugged my shoulders and thought, rather her than me, and carried on with my work. About 2 minutes later, I had James tapping me on the shoulder. My reputation as weird language girl was well known by this point, and it had become clear that Naomi's caller wasn't deaf. She just didn't understand the language, and they wanted me to take over the call. I had a better chance than most of understanding, but let's be realistic here. There are hundreds of languages, and I only know 3 of them well enough to conduct an emergency call. Thankfully, when I took over the call, this little old lady started babbling away in one of my languages. I thought that was the hardest part of the call, and was over. We were no longer lost in translation. We could get her an ambulance for her chest pain or broken hip or whatever was bothering her, and I could be on my way. Nope. They're all staring, like they're shocked, like they can't move. The lady said. I'm translating for ease of listening, obviously. My 3 grandchildren, they're here. Their mom and dad left them with me, and I've done something wrong, and they're just staring. Well, now I have a dilemma. Am I dealing with 3 young patients, or 1 confused elderly woman? What did she mean by, I've done something wrong? Was this about to turn into a murder investigation? Not only was I conducting my first ever non-English emergency call, we normally have translators for this kind of thing, but Naomi couldn't even figure out what language she needed, and by the time I was talking to her, she'd worked herself up into a near frenzy, so putting her on hold and waiting for an interpreter didn't seem like the best idea. but it was one of the weirdest calls I've ever dealt with. While I tried to figure out if the glassy-eyed, staring kids were actually there or not, the old woman wandered over to the window and started to cry. She could see her neighbor outside in the front garden, and he was staring right through the window, right at her. I asked loads of questions. Were they moving? Were they speaking? Were they making any noises at all? Could she see them breathing? What happened if she touched them? Every question just made her more hysterical. She described for me in vivid details how her grandchildren were staring. She named them for me. She gave me their ages. She told me about them. Suddenly, she panicked. She told me they were screaming, but no sound was coming out. She looked out her window. Her neighbor was screaming too. She was sobbing, pleading with me to send help, begging me to do something to stop these children from staring at her in horror. All logic and reason told me that these were the hallucinations of a terrified elderly woman with an evident deterioration in her mental health. Still, it was so real. She described them so clearly. I wondered if something had happened. I've always thought about what would happen if I took a call from patient 0, the first patient of a world-ending pandemic. It's one of those thoughts that crosses my mind late at night when I should be sleeping, ready for a 12-hour shift the next day. And it keeps me up until dawn. I'm not gullible. I'm not easily led. Still, there was a little nugget of doubt at the back of my mind. What if something happened? What if this remote farming village was the source of an outbreak of people just standing frozen to the spot, staring? Some kind of illness causing focal seizures and paralysis, perhaps. The more I thought about it, the more it fell within the realms of possibility. And this poor woman, she was convinced that her 3 grandchildren were stood in the living room staring at her. In her mind, she had been watching the grandchildren for the day, and she'd done something wrong, and now none of them would respond to her. The phenomenon had spread to the neighbor too, and now, in her eyes at least, she was the only conscious person left. As the creepiness reached fever-pitch levels, I wonder if I'd look up from the computer screen to see all my colleagues staring at me, their mouths fixed in identical silent screams. I heard the door open in the background and someone shouted a cheery, "Hello," in English. The elderly woman didn't understand, but there was a small kerfuffle as the phone was passed on to the newcomer. "Who's this?" the woman asked. I had to get the burning question out of the way first. I asked if there were 3 glassy-eyed, unresponsive children in the house. Nope, just the elderly woman. I explained the situation, how she could only speak in her native language and seemed very distressed. The woman, who turned out to be a carer, explained that the elderly woman was now almost entirely incapable of speaking English as her dementia worsened considerably in the last few months. She'd forgotten the language she'd spoken for almost all of her adult life, retreating into the comfort and security of her mother tongue. Her grandchildren live in Australia, on the other side of the world, and there certainly weren't any neighbors staring in through the windows. Once the call was over and I'd had a few moments to recover before putting my headset back on and going green once more, the call didn't seem creepy at all. It was the dementia-induced illusion of an elderly woman. It was real for her, though, and that made it real for me. We aren't allowed to doubt our callers or question their integrity. If they tell us that something is happening to them, as far as we're concerned, it's happening. We may not be convinced, but we have to at least give the impression that we are. The caller was convinced that something horrific was happening to everyone she knew and loved. The scary thing is, for a short amount of time on that call, I was almost convinced that it was happening too. This one seemed fun when I wrote it out. The creepiness is explained. No one got hurt. Sounds like a winner, right? Reading it back, it's just sad. I'm starting to wonder if we really do get fun calls in ambulance control. Or if we have to laugh, because if we don't, we'll cry. Maybe I'm just stressed at the moment. The test calls are coming in thick and fast, and I'm scared that one of my colleagues, my friends, the people I consider my second family, is going to make a mistake. The next update will be a series of shorter anecdotes. Some from me, some that I've been gathering from my colleagues. Who knows? Maybe we'll get a fun, creepy one for you all next time. Or maybe not.